This lesson has 5 subsections, and we'll go through them in turn. First, some very basic terminology. What is the Middle East? Second, a bit about demographics. Who lives in that part of the world? Third, we'll introduce some of the current balance of power issues. Who's on whose side? Fourth, we'll just list some of the major historical turning points, like seismic shifts that have altered and defined the region. And fifth, if we have time today, we're going to get into the question of human security in the Middle East. But notice that that's not all here. We also have some videos. Sometimes videos are required, so make sure that you look at these. In this case, primer videos. The first is required, plus at least one other. Notice that I've listed it as a key political issue. That's because the US-Saudi Arabia relationship is one of the keys to unlocking the politics of the region. Also, I've put on here a couple of political cartoons. Take a look at how these capture the relationship between the US and the Middle East. The first one kind of caricatures long-standing relations really going back to the 80s. It's like a vicious circle, and it's been fueling violence across the region and terror attacks in the West, from 9/11 to Charlie Hebdo in Paris, and many more. And notice the second cartoon. Here we are reminded that US industry makes billions of dollars selling arms to the Middle East. One might think that's a conflict of interest for US foreign policy, but these are, of course, political satire cartoons, but there's usually some kernel of truth to satire. As well, your reading for the week. Required readings must be done by our weekly Thursday discussion session. You should be prepared to talk about the reading. So let's start the first subsection, boundaries of the Middle East. What is the Middle East? Seems like a simple question, but it's not. The term itself is a 20th century term. It's the successor term to the slightly more archaic 19th century term, the Near East. Middle East has just become more common in usage. And it's certainly problematic. It's problematic for a whole host of reasons. It has a colonial history. After all, it describes the region from the European perspective. It's the Middle East, right? And of course, from the perspective of Asia, it's not East. So it's a construct of Europe to begin with. Also, it reduces a complex region of many peoples and many religions to a simplistic geographic term. However, I'm going to suggest that it's perfectly fine to use it. It may be the best term we've got, or at least the least bad term we have to describe the region. Everybody knows what Middle East means, more or less. Yet, to understand what it actually signifies, we're going to have to make a few detours, starting with asking, where is the Middle East? To ask what is the Middle East is to ask where is the Middle East? What are its boundaries? Well, this is what I'm calling the Middle East. And this reflects a fairly common usage, though it does vary. There's, in fact, a lot of disagreement. For example, it's recently become more common to refer to this region instead as North Africa and the Middle East, or Middle East and North Africa, MENA. And you can see why. It recognizes that North Africa is a part of the region. So it seems more precise to say North Africa and the Middle East. And most academics use this term. That's fine. I think it's also fine to stick with just the Middle East. In fact, I think it might be better to just stick with the Middle East. It's less of a mouthful, but also North Africa has already been understood to be part of the Middle East. Think of Egypt and Libya. Most people agree that Egypt and Libya are part of the Middle East. So to say MENA, Middle East and North Africa, might be redundant. In fact, it's like saying Egypt and Libya are not part of the Middle East, right? If they're in North Africa, then they're not in the Middle East. Seems redundant, but also counterintuitive and confused. The point about the boundaries of the Middle East and what we call it should become clearer as we go. The truth is, there's no single or universally accepted definition of the region. For example, take a look at these maps. First one, don't worry about the fine print here, but you can see the region it signifies. According to this map, the Middle East does not include Egypt. In fact, it does not include Turkey, just these core countries here. According to this map of the Middle East, it's a little bit bigger. you've got Turkey in it, and you've got Egypt. I think this is a pretty good common interpretation of what the Middle East is. Very common. Now look at this one. This one extends the Middle East all the way to Afghanistan. Quite different. And on this one that I found, the Greater Middle East, I like that concept, the Greater Middle East, but it's a little bit ridiculous that it extends to India. And finally, look at this one, this map of the Greater East. I appreciate the way this one is more color-coded. The darker green is the core region, and the more peripheral countries are in the lighter green. So what are we to make of this? You've got 5 very different maps claiming to describe the same region. Well, so in the face of that, in the face of these different definitions of the region's boundaries, we just have to settle and pick one. And in my opinion, this one, the Middle East, based on approximately this map, makes the most sense. It's not just arbitrary. And it really has to do with who lives in the region. And that takes us to demographics, the second subsection, population and religion. Notice first, the Middle East is almost entirely Muslim in religion, but let's set that aside for a minute. What are the major nationalities, the major ethno-linguistic cultures? Well, there are 3 main nationalities. First and foremost, the region is mostly Arab. More than half the total population of the region shown here is Arab. After Arab, the next 2 major blocks are Turks and Iranians, with about 80 million each. And notice, while almost all the Turks are in one country, Turkey, and almost all the Iranians are in one country, Iran, the Arabs are spread across about 22 countries. What defines these groups as groups? Well, they do. They self-identify as nations with shared ethno-linguistic histories. The Arabs speak Arabic and they share Arabic history and culture. The Turks speak Turkish and they share Turkish history and culture. And Iranians or Persians speak Farsi or Parsi and they share a distinct Persian history, language, and culture. And their histories have been shared, bound together by history and geography and religion. But to talk about the region without the Turks, or the region without the Iranians, or the region without the Arabs would be like talking about Europe without the Germans, or Europe without the French. So again, with those maps that we saw, to cut out Turkey doesn't make any sense. To arbitrarily cut in half the Arab world, based on some notion of the Middle East being separate from North Africa, doesn't make a lot of sense. I think that any map or any boundaries that we ascribe to the region needs to encompass these 3 main national groups, the Arabs, the Turks, and the Iranians. Of course, it's not really that simple as this color-coded map makes it seem. There are minorities in all of these countries, and there are many other ethno-linguistic groups in addition to Arabs, Turks, and Iranians, just a lot fewer in number. Look, 30 million Berbers and 30 million Kurds. They're probably the next 2 largest groups in terms of population, but there is no Berber state, no Kurdish nation state. In fact, they're minorities in many countries across the region, often repressed or second-class citizens in the countries they live in. The Israelis are the major exception. They have their nation state, Israel. Even though they're only about 8 million people, they have major influence in the region. Their military is the strongest, one of the strongest in the world, in fact. Israel is the only country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. So in terms of sheer population numbers and geographic size, Israel is very small. So by the numbers, these are the national demographics of the region. Okay, what about religion? The region is overwhelmingly Muslim. Remember, Islam is the religion, and the people who practice it are called Muslims. It's the 3rd great religion of the book, building on the line of prophets from the Jewish Old Testament and of the Christian New Testament, adding a new chapter revealed by the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century AD. So Islam is the youngest of the 3 great monotheistic religions, but it's also the fastest growing. We should mention here the 2 main sects of Islam, Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. Sunni is the majority. It's the majority sect of the whole Muslim world. And Shia, sometimes called Shi'i or Shiite, is a minority. And there are Shia minorities in most Muslim countries. but they are concentrated, and the large majority, in Iran. So when we say the Middle East, we're not referring to any one national group or even any one religion, even though it's mostly Muslim. In fact, it's not even a strictly geographic term. When we say the Middle East, it's more of a political concept, right? If we say North Africa, that's very clearly referring to a part of a continent. If we say South America or East Asia, you can point to it on a map. The Middle East is a little bit more ambiguous. It's not a strictly geographic term. It's a political concept, and it's just meant to serve as a bundle of ideas for the different peoples and religions of the region. It's really no different than the West. We say the West, everybody knows what it means, even though it's problematic, but it's not a geographic term. The West includes Australia. Where is that west of? So I think we don't need to add the North Africa and the Middle East, because that's combining a geographic term with a political concept. But in any case, it should suffice to say that though it's complicated, it's perfectly fine to refer to this region as the Middle East. Okay, that takes us to political alignments, balance of power issues. We're going to go over every detail of this slide bit by bit, starting with a few things to note. First note, font size. The font size signifies here the major players. The bigger the font, the greater their influence or political clout in the region. So on that basis, we can say that the major players of the region are Iran, Saudi Arabia and its partner Gulf monarchs, Turkey, and Israel. And then lesser countries and groups in smaller fonts mostly line up under either Iranian influence or Saudi influence, whereas the Turks and Israel are more like lone regional powers, single states with big influence. Second note, color blocks. The color blocks show the approximate political alliances in the countries and the groups listed on the right and transposed on the map. See that the color blocks don't perfectly match the state borders. So you can see the green color, Iran's political influence, extending into part of Iraq, but not all of Iraq. And it extends into most of Syria, but not all of Syria. These are networks of allegiances and proxies that cross state borders and divide countries, complicating the politics of the region and intensifying its conflicts. Third note, basically every government or group listed on this page is officially pro-Western or pro-US, except for the green bloc under Iran and what remains of the Islamic State, ISIS, in the gray color. All the other countries and groups under the red bloc, including Turkey and Israel, are all formally pro-West in their leadership and mostly cooperate with Western policies, security and economic. Now, what their populations think is something quite different, but in terms of the leadership and the official policy, those countries are aligned with Western interest. We consider them our partners. Whereas the countries and the groups in the green bloc under Iranian sway are therefore considered the bad guys because their leaders are officially opposed to Western policy and influence. Of course, it's all a bit messier than this, but this is approximate and it gets us into the ballpark. Now let's break this down a little bit more. Here we see the major fault line in the Middle East today, these two competing blocs, the Iranian-Saudi divide. They haven't gone directly to war, but they struggle for position across the region through proxy powers and proxy wars. We're going to talk more about the Saudi-Iranian Cold War as we go forward in a number of sections in future lessons. Looking specifically at the green bloc, the governments and groups listed in this box are mostly united by their anti-US and anti-Israel politics. They consider themselves the anti-imperial resistance. In the West, they're often considered state sponsors of terror. As for the Saudi bloc, the governments and leaders of this group, Western partners, formally pro-US and increasingly pro-Israel, at least in practice, if not always formal policy. Because these countries have long been aligned against Israel, but this group of countries have been increasingly normalizing relations with Israel, often unofficially and behind closed doors. But as far as their alliance with the West, it's very public and official, even though many people in the country are not necessarily supportive of that political alignment. These countries, quite simply, feel threatened by Iran's expanding influence, especially since 2003. Why 2003? Well, you could check your glossary of wars and treaties to see what happened in 2003. That's another course resource. So this group has been actively seeking Western support to balance and push back against Iran. And we should note that Israel shares their anti-Iranian position, but has little formal cooperation with this group. Here, the governments and leaders of these diverse blocs are mostly loyal to themselves, though with varying levels of anti-Iran sentiment. Indeed, opposition to Iran is really what kind of unites most of the countries and groups shown here. As much as Israel has awkward and problematic relations with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, they share their overriding concern about Iran's expanding influence. And partly because of that concern, they've been moving towards normalizing relations. And as I indicate here, each of these, Turkey, Israel, the Kurds, and even the Islamic State, sometimes tough to pin down exactly where their allegiances are. They sometimes shift around, and sometimes they have clandestine or covert relations with many other groups in the region. For example, you may have heard that Turkey has often been accused of secretly providing aid to ISIS for its own political reasons. A further point of complication here, notice that some of these parties are split with one foot in either camp, including Iraq. So under the Iranian influence, the Iraqi government, which happens to be mostly Shia in sect, is on a different side of this Cold War than much of the population of Iraq, which is more aligned with Saudi interests. And this is the Sunni sect. Similarly, Syria also has one foot in either camp. The Syrian government is aligned with Iran, and the Syrian opposition is aligned with the Gulf states. Yemen, the Houthi opposition movement, is mostly aligned with Iran, but the government that is recognized by the West is mostly aligned with Saudi Arabia. And Palestine, the Palestinian Hamas Islamic movement, is under the Iranian influence, whereas the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is mostly aligned with the Red Bloc, pro-US. Okay, so we've talked about the boundaries of the region and how we define it, some of the demographics, the major nations of the region, the messy political alliances, which we're going to be unpacking as we go through this course in future lessons and in our readings. Now we want to switch to some of the key dates, some of those political earthquakes that define the region. Think about the time 1948. This is right after the Second World War, right after the horrors of the Holocaust have become known, and the Jewish people, who have been minorities in so many countries but without a nation state of their own, finally founded Israel in 1948. The Jewish people, who so much needed a place of refuge, there were hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees in Europe after the Second World War. Many of them found a home in Israel. The problem here is that as Israel was formed, the Palestinians were displaced. Remember too that this is a time of decolonization. European empires are rolling back. There's new independent nation states emerging and joining the UN, not the Palestinians. They never got the national independence they thought was their inheritance, because Israel was created on the land that they called home. This will be the focus of section 3, coming up in a few lessons. Jumping ahead a little bit, 1953 is another crucial year for the Middle East. It's the year that the US and the UK conspired to overthrow Iran's democratically elected government. There was a covert operation, a military coup, and when it was over, the West had imposed the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, who was very friendly to the West, but not very popular in his own country, so he pretty much had to rule as a dictator. This event is inextricably linked to the revolution of 1979. 25 years after the West installed the Shah to rule Iran, overthrowing the democratically elected government, the Iranians rose up to overthrow the Shah, the king. And when the revolution was over, the Islamic Republic of Iran was born, and it was ruled now by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. Ever since this event, Iran has been in opposition to the West. Iran was the US's closest partner in the region until the revolution. Another crucial event, 1967, the Six-Day War. This was an event that began the Israeli occupation. You've all heard of the occupation of the West Bank, the occupation of Palestinian land. It began formally in 1967 as a result of the Six-Day War. 20 years later, the Palestinians rose up in a mass popular uprising, and it really changed the terms of the conflict in ways that we'll see. 2001, Al-Qaeda attacks the United States and triggers the War on Terror, which is still going on today, leading to the US invasion and occupation of Iraq, as well as attacks on other countries. And I would say the last major key date that we should be thinking about is 2011. The Arab Spring begins. In the Arab Spring, people poured into the streets and demanded the removal of their corrupt dictators for life. As a consequence of the Arab Spring, which began for many people very optimistically, it seemed to signify that the region was becoming more open and accountable and secular and democratic, but it quickly descended into conflict, most notably the Syrian war. So this is a crash course of some of the key turning point dates of the region. And I leave it to you to explore in the meantime with the course glossary, the glossary of wars and international agreements. That expands on all of these and more. And as we go forward, I'll try to flag which sections of that glossary you should be reading for which sections of the course we cover. And finally, let's take a moment to think about the Middle East through the lens of human security. Human security is a relatively new concept. It's been gaining ground over the last 20 to 30 years. The term is meant to draw our attention away from states and national interests and international relations, and to focus instead on people. If you've studied political science, especially international relations, you know that security, state security, is a predominant focus. Some would say an unhealthy fixation. So policymakers working with the UN and with other international organizations and NGOs came up with this idea of human security. Draws our attention to many forms of human precarity, such as the insecurity of refugees and displaced people. The Syrian war has produced the greatest number of displaced people since World War II. Most of the refugees, but not all, that have fled to Europe during the refugee crisis were Syrian. Then there's the insecurities that arise for people from conflicts, which are exacerbated by foreign meddling and interventions. Human security also draws our attention to human rights violations by the many unaccountable regimes of the region. Although sometimes the discourse of human security has avoided the language of human rights. After all, if the idea of human rights couldn't get through to states after all these years, maybe human security is a better frame of reference. Putting human needs in terms that states can understand, security. So people lack security when the price of food is disproportionately high, as it is across the region, including the price of bread, the basic staple. When much of the Arab world rose up against their dictators in 2011, they called for the removal of the regimes, they called for freedom and dignity, and they called for bread. Scarcity of water is another major source of insecurity across the region, along with poverty and unemployment, quite unlike anything we've known in the West in our generation. There are exceptions. For example, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Israel are some of the richest, most affluent nations in the world. But for the most part, the Middle East is characterized by relative poverty and gender inequality. Human security calls our attention to the precarity and oppression of women in much of the region, often forced through conservative social policies and religious interpretations. This is a sensitive topic. I don't mean to suggest that every woman who wears a hijab and stays out of public to focus on raising the family is oppressed. For many women in the region, this is their culture and they embrace it. Of course, it's hard to know when women's rights are so restricted. Counterintuitively, despite the stereotype of oppressed women in the Middle East, and of course it varies from country to country, you'll still find women often become active political agents in social movements, in protest movements, as leaders in the street. It's probably more common than most people in the West assume. So these are some of the ways that the concept of human security draws our attention to the very real problems and struggles that people face. I haven't reproduced any statistics here, but this part of the lesson is expanded in detail in this week's reading. One of the 2 chapters by Gelvin is all about human security. So after you've gone over the Gelvin chapter on human security, I've also left you a few breadcrumb trails to read more about the issue here if you explore optional resources. I've got a UN document on human security, a series of Arab human development reports, and a couple of academic articles that take a critical look at the concept of human security. These are optional resources. You can pursue them for further reading or for research. They're not required. Okay, that brings us to the end of lesson 1. We've covered the 5 subsections. I've pointed you towards the required reading and some required viewing. And now I'm going to link to the feedback form where you can address a couple of questions and provide some feedback that we'll address in our live Zoom session. And going forward, next week, we're going to be going over section 2, Orientalism and Colonialism. For now, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you soon.